Shalom, my dear friends. Shalom. I hope you can hear me okay today. Our technical problems seem to have been overcome temporarily with our sound. How long this will be the case remains to be seen. The mixing board is becoming a little temperamental in its advanced age, so we'll see how we will proceed. In the meantime, we're hanging in there. And God willing, we will be able today to proceed with our studies. So with that, let us turn to the study of the book of Hosea. Shalom today, the 11th day of the month of Adar of the year 5778, corresponding to the 26th of February of the year 2018. We continue today with our studies in the book of Hosea, the prophet, the first of the Trei Asar, coming now to chapter 13, starting at verse 1 and going to verse 11, which is all one continuous parasha. And then after verse 11, we will be going into a new parasha, new section that goes continuously until from verse 11 of chapter 13 until the end of chapter 14, verse 1. For some inexplicable reason, the printers of the Bible chose to break the chapters at the where they did at the end of chapter 13 and the beginning of chapter 14. Chopping off from the Hebrew parasha its last verse, which is chapter 14, verse 1, and thereby somewhat distorting the whole sense to those who are not aware that there's really a parasha break after the end of chapter 14, verse 1, beginning with chapter 14, verse 2. But we shall come to that when we reach it. For the moment, let us realize that, as discussed in our previous session, chapter 13, verse 1 is a direct continuation from the previous section. It's all part of one parasha going continuously, as we discussed in the previous session, from the beginning of chapter 12 all the way to chapter 13, verse 10. So, as we had seen in the previous session, in chapter 12, the prophet is almost musing in the sense of going from one subject to the other. And as we saw, there was reference to, according to the interpretations of our sages, there was a reference to the one that founded the northern kingdom, namely Jeraboam ben Nevat. And we shall see that this theme continues in Hosea chapter 13, verse 1. To go now to the Hebrew text, we should just look back to the end of the previous chapter where we saw that the prophet castigated Ephraim, after speaking about the great blessings that God gave to Israel and bring them out of Egypt and guarding them, with great ingratitude, Ephraim angered God with the sins of Ephraim. And Rashi, on the last verse of chapter 13, had introduced the concept of the ingratitude of Ephraim as contrasting as after all of the goodness that God did to them, the ingratitude was that he turned Jeraboam ben Nevat, Jeraboam turned the people to idolatry, which is a worse crime than killing people, because by causing people to turn to idolatry, their souls are destroyed. If the person gets killed, they have the life of the world to come, whereas if they if they are subverted to idolatry, their life in the world to come is severely damaged. And so that was the accusation against Ephraim, the kingdom, the northern kingdom. And now in verse 1 of chapter 13, according to our sages and all of our commentators, the reference again is to Jeraboam. So reading now the Hebrew text of Hosea chapter 13, verse 1. Kedaber Ephraim reseis Nosohu b'Yisrael vayesham babal vayomos. The Hebrew word reses that Ephraim was speaking about is an expression that has the connotation of trembling and shaking. And a great trembling and shaking came when Ephraim spoke. What was it that Ephraim was speaking about? For this, let us turn to Rashi in his commentary. Kedaber Ephraim reseis, explains Rashi, Keshe kino Jeraboam lamokom v'diber keneged Shlomo devorim kashim. When Jeroboam showed zealousness for God and spoke against Solomon harsh words. This is referring to the to the episode that is in First Book of Kings, chapter 11, verse 26. Where we see that the Jeroboam stood up against King Solomon for taking part of the public amenities of Jerusalem, namely areas that were used for the public to congregate, and devoting it to his foreign wives. And in this he was very just. But thereafter, he, according to Rashi, continuing with Rashi's comment, he spoke these harsh words against King Solomon, which was quite a feat because, of course, King Solomon was the wisest that ever lived. And here is Jeraboam, who was not simply some kind of upstart revolutionary, but according to our rabbis, was an outstanding master of the entire Torah. So when he stood up against King Solomon, this created this trembling and shaking because Solomon was a great king. And on account of Jeroboam's been willing to stand up against him, as now the verse Rashi continues to explain, Nosahu b'Yisrael, that was when he was elevated in Israel. From there, from that episode, he was worthy of being given prominence to be the king of Israel. But what happened, the tragic end of Jeroboam, who was fearful the people would go back to the house of David and therefore establish the idols of Dan and Beersheba to distract them from Jerusalem, says Rashi, Vayesham Baal, he sinned with the Baal when he arose to greatness. He sinned with idolatry. And continues Rashi, Vayomos, he died, Nichras beis Yeroboam v'chein beis Achav. The house of Jeroboam was cut off, and so too the house of Ahab. Now, Targum Yonason, quoted here by Rashi, translates, when one of the house of Ephraim spoke, then trembling took hold of all the nations. They attained leadership in Israel, but when they sinned with the worship of idols, that was when they were killed. And going back to verse 2 now of the Hebrew text, V'ato yoisifu lachatoi, vayasu lohem, Maseicho mikaspom kisevunom atzabim Maseicho roshim kuloi lohem hem oimerihim zoivechei odom agolim ishokun. But now, after that history of idolatry from the time of Jeraboam, they've added to sin even more, and they've made molten images, idols, out of their silver. Through their understanding have they made these images, the work of craftsmen, all of it. And to them they say, those who sacrifice men, they will kiss the calves. Well, here we also need some help from our commentators to understand what is going on. So again, to turn to Rashi, on the word now, he says, well, this is the further development in the idolatry of the northern kingdom. The house of Yehu, the son of Nimshi, who was the one who came to take vengeance on the house of Ahab. They saw the fate that befell the houses of Jeroboam and of Ahab, but nevertheless the house of Yehu continued to sin, as we find again in Book of Kings. Second book of Kings, Yehu was, after inflicting the vengeance on the house of Ahab, himself went on to worship the Baal and to continue with the idolatry of the northern kingdom. And in the latter part of the verse, Rashi comments this strange phrase, they that sacrifice man will kiss the calves. He says this is the prophet quoting disparagingly the words of the prophets, the words of the priests of the Molech idol, the Molech being the idol to whom people were enjoined to sacrifice some of their male offspring. So the priests of the Molech, and we do find in the Book of Kings that Molech worship was very extensive in the land at that time. They would say to Israel, anybody who will sacrifice his son to the idol, he will be worthy to kiss the calf, because that is a very precious gift that he has offered to the idol. That is the way that our sages have explained this verse in Tractate Sanhedrin, and Rashi says that their explanation is more fitting with the text of the verse than the translation of Yonatan. Let us look briefly at the translation of Yonatan on this verse. Now they are increasing their sin, and they've made idols out of their silver according to their images, the work of craftsmen, all of them. To them, they are, after them they're going astray. The prophets of falsehood are deceiving those who are sacrificing, and they're offering oxen to the calves and sacrificing to these calves. So the Midrash of the sages in Sanhedrin, quoted by Rashi in his first explanation, adds some color and flavor to the meaning here. Going now on to verse 3. Lo chain yehiyo ka'anan boker v'chatal mashkim holeich kemoitz yeso'er migoyren hoche oshon me'arubo. Indeed, they will be temporary, just like the morning clouds in the land of Israel that soon disappear as the heat of the day increases, like the dew that is early to appear but then It goes quickly away like the chaff that the wind whirls away from the threshing floor, and like the smoke from a window. Several graphic images here of the evanescence of the northern kingdom that the prophet is prophesying. Verse 4, V'hanaychi Adonai Elohecho me'eretz Mitzrayim Ve'elohim zulasi lo seido u'moishia ayin bilti. And God again emphasizes that they should not have rebelled, because God has been watching over Israel from the time of the exodus from Egypt. Ani yedaticho b'midbar be'eretz tal uvohis. I knew you in the wilderness, God's personal providence over Israel, direct providence over Israel throughout the wilderness. This wilderness perhaps is a metaphor for the wilderness of the world. The phrase be'eretz tal uvois, this word in Hebrew, the tal uvois, it appears only in this place in the Tanakh. Now, a tel is some kind of mound or hill, and uvois is said by our commentators to be related to the root avor, to desire. It's in the wilderness, one is filled with desires for everything because nothing is available. The traveler in the wilderness, as he succumbs to the desert heat and begins to enter into the world of mirages and hallucinations, he wants everything because nothing is available. And here God is teaching us that despite the appearance of this world where so much is lacking, nevertheless God is watching over us all the time. And if so, how could we sin against him? And yet that's what Ephraim did. Kemar isohom vayizebahu vahiyarem libom al kein shechachoni. In accordance with their grazing, the lushness of the pastures in which they grazed, they had satisfaction, and the more they were satisfied, the more their hearts became haughty. The essential sin already which we were warned against in Moses' discourses in Deuteronomy, not to say when we get established and wealthy that it is our own strength and the strength of our hand that brought about all of this. But that's precisely what happened in the tragic story of Ephraim. Through their very prosperity, they forgot God. And now, again, the prophet comes into his dire warnings of the retribution for this. Vo'ehi lohem kamoi shohal k'nomer al derech oshur. And I shall be to them like a shachal, shachal is one of the species of the lions, k'namer, like a leopard. On the path shall I look out for them. One might be inclined to want to translate here the word Ashur as a reference to Assyria, that the people were all the time going off to Assyria and trying to use them as part of their plans to protect themselves, and it was not to be. I would just like to restore your text to a visible amount on your screen. So let me just adjust that, please. And However, Rashi in his comment says that that is not a possible translation of the word Ashur here. It's not that God is saying that he will be like a leopard on their path to Assyria because of the where the note of the cantillation is on the second syllable, on the shur, and that is proof that this comes from the Hebrew root shur, to look, as in Book of Numbers, Bil'am says, I see it but not now, ashureno v'lo ato, the same verb, ashureno. And so it's speaking about the, perhaps there is an allusion to Assyria here, but grammatically Rashi points out that it's talking about God lurking to take the vengeance on Ephraim. And it will come directly to them, verse 8. Efkeshehim kedoi v'shakul ve'ekra sugor libom v'yoichlem sham kelovi chayas hasodeh tevak ahem. I shall meet them like a bear that has been robbed of her young. The mother bear is absolutely enraged by the loss of her children, and will do anything to attack their attackers. That is one possible interpretation of shakul, that the word shakul goes on the bear itself. Another, the interpretation favored by Rashi is that the word shakul is the same grammatically as rachum and chanun, namely it's an epithet applied to the bear that causes the loss of young to others. So this wild bear is going to attack them, and I shall tear their closed hearts and consume them there like a lion, like the beast of the field shall rip them apart. Now we see here in these verses a number of different wild animals. Well, in the prophecies of the visions of Daniel, the lion applies to Babylon, and the bear to Persia, and the namir sometimes to Greece. And perhaps here are some of the exiles being alluded to in this verse. So now coming to verse 9, Shichesecho Yisrael Kivi ve'ezrecho. Well, here once again the very terse language of Hosea. Shichesecho, which is reminiscent of Deuteronomy Ha'azinu, where God says, is the failure that of God? No, it's that of Israel. Shichesecho Yisrael, it's your shachas, your destruction, your undoing. You have caused it for yourselves. It's your responsibility. This is the explanation of Rashi here. Chovalto atzmecho Israel, you have injured yourself, Israel, because you sinned against me. You have rebelled against the very one that helps you. Mikro kotzorhu, this is a terse, abbreviated verse in our text. If somebody is familiar with the way that the language of our sacred texts, then this explanation will indeed be satisfactory in the person's heart. They'll see this indeed fits with the characteristic style of our text. And what is this phrase in the Hebrew? Ki vi. Ki vi, the emphasis of the prophet is on saying that for against me, that is to say against God Almighty, was the rebellion, that you have rebelled. And if you say, so what? What does it matter to you? Well, you have rebelled against the very one that helps you when you have rebelled against me. And turning back to now, verse 10 in the text, Ehi malkecho eifoi, v'yoshiacho b'chol orecho, v'shoiftecho, asher omalto tenoli melech v'sorim. According to Rashi's explanation on this verse, the word vo'ehi means that I was and shall remain. God remains Israel's only savior. And therefore the question is, Malkecho Eifo, so where is your king? The king that you requested. Let your king try to save you and all of your sinners. Let your judges save you, those of whom you said, give me a king and ministers. This can be explained on a simple level, that God is saying the whole political apparatus that was created by the northern kingdom in rebellion against the house of David, the messianic king, was as we've seen, an idolatrous political dictatorship, and it's going to simply disintegrate, as in fact did happen. We see in the latter part of the book of Kings, at the time of the reign of Hezekiah, the whole northern kingdom fell apart and the tribes were taken into exile. And verse 11, the conclusion of this parasha, Etein lecho melech biapi, vo'ekach be'evrosi. I gave you a king in my anger, and I shall take him away in my wrath. In other words, once again, we see here this different attitude to the kingship of Israel. According to Metzudat David in his commentary here, this is referring to the request of the people to appoint a king in the time of Samuel. And although the Torah indeed makes it a commandment for the people to appoint a king, the way that the people demanded the king in the time of Samuel was not considered proper, because they wanted Israel to be a political entity like all the other nations of the world, and that was not to be, because Israel's only true king is God, and the only role of the king of Israel is to turn the hearts of the people to God. So when particularly the kings of the northern kingdom tried to turn Israel into a world power, which indeed, according to our sages, it was in the time of Ahav, with influence over all of the surrounding nations, this was considered wrongful. And therefore, if God did answer their request in the time of Samuel, it was not God's beneficence to them, but rather his anger, as if to say, well, let's take a look and see where this will get you. And indeed it all fell apart, as we see with the collapse of the northern kingdom and the exile of the tribes. And with that we conclude this section of the prophet, and the next section from chapter 13 verse 12 until the first verse of chapter 14 is a kind of summation of the whole sad and sorry history of the northern kingdom and its imminent collapse, before we come to the glorious conclusion of Hosea with his call to all the people to repent, which we shall come to, God willing, in our next session. So with that, my friends, we shall take now a brief interval, and after that we shall return to our studies of the laws of the salting of meat and the laws of kashrut. I'd just like to restore your text to a visible mount on your screen to protect themselves. It was not to be. However, Rashi in his comment says that that is not a Shalom, my dear friends, back again now to our studies, continuing with the laws of the salting of meat in preparation for eating kosher meat. Shalom, today, the 11th day of the month of Adar of the year 5778, corresponding to the 26th of February of the year 2018. We continue with our studies in the work by the late Rabbi Aaron Pfeiffer, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, abbreviated laws of the process of salting meat or roasting meat to remove any remaining blood in the meat. And we come now to the second section of the book, Siman Bet, the first chapter, where we should be examining different approaches by different rabbinical authorities to the subject of the rinsing of the meat that precedes the actual salting process. So let us go into follow the text here, which is available for download in the Hebrew on the class page of azamra.org website. And so in the first chapter of Siman Bet, Rabbi Pfeiffer explains that meat is not kasher, is not fit for being cooked until after any blood that was absorbed in the fibers of the meat has been drawn out. And for that reason, all meat prior to cooking it must be well salted with salt, because the nature of salt is that when it is applied over the surface of the meat, it will draw out to itself all the blood that is absorbed in the meat and will cause it to exude outwards. And as the Talmud explains in Tractate Chulin, which is one of the major sources of all of the laws of kashrut, the Talmud explains the basic process of the salting of meat. And here we're going to have a simple presentation of the entire process from beginning to end, and we shall be entering in intricate detail into that process in all of the remaining sections of this book. The order of the salting, as explained in the Talmud, is that firstly it is necessary to rinse the meat very well with water. Afterwards, we apply the salt to the meat and leave the meat in its salt for the requisite amount of time for the salting. Afterwards, it's necessary again to rinse the meat very well with water, and with that, the meat has been kashered, purified, ready for cooking. And for that reason, the person who wants to kosher the Jewish slaughtered meat for consumption must understand these three subject areas: the laws of the rinsing of the meat prior to the salting, the laws of the actual salting itself, and thirdly, the laws of the rinsing of the meat after the salting process. And here we will be discussing in this section the laws of the rinsing prior to the salting. And we find among the Rishonim, that is the outstanding authorities of the earlier Middle Ages, we find four different approaches to the purpose of the rinsing of the meat prior to the salting. And in order to understand how the final rulings of the halakha are founded, it is necessary to understand these four different approaches to the rinsing process. And for that reason, we should be going into these four approaches in some detail now. And before we launch into this, let us understand that, as we shall see when we look in detail into these four approaches to the reason for the first rinsing of the meat, that each one has a rationale. We're not God forbid saying that these different authorities came up with their own views about what is the purpose of the salting, and this affects the halachic decisions that come out of that according to their views. We are saying that their views actually represent different possible approaches to the to the subject, because not just that different people look at things differently, but that there are indeed in the process of the rinsing different possibilities, and these must be reflected in the halakha. And as we shall see in the ensuing sections of the discussion of the laws of the rinsing, it makes a difference to the halachic decision. The halachic decision always, where possible, tries to take account of all of the different viewpoints, because that is the purpose of the Torah, is to make peace and integrate different parts of the picture and the array all into a unity. There are times when we are faced with difficult situations where there might be considerable financial loss if we apply a stricter view, and for that reason the halachic posek, the one that makes the decision if confronted with a question, has to understand the foundations of the halacha in order to understand when it is possible and permissible to rule more leniently and when it is not possible to do so. So with that, let us look at these 4 different approaches to why must the meat be rinsed before the salting. The first approach, now the Hebrew word for a halachic approach is a shita. Shita in Hebrew is a word for a great log of wood, and also a word for a row or an order. And different shitot, different approaches, different lines of approach are typical of rabbinical thinking, because different authorities draw out each one a particular aspect of God's remarkable and diverse creation. So the first shita, the first approach to the purpose of the salting, is that it is to, in a very simple and practical manner, when the butcher, after the slaughter of the animal, he starts cutting up the limbs of the animal, so there's going to be blood on the surface of the meat. And the first approach is that if we do not rinse off the blood that is on the surface of the meat, the moment that salt is applied to the surface of the meat, that salt will cause the blood that was on the exterior to go back into the meat. As the pores of the meat expand, the blood on the surface will get absorbed back in, because that is the nature of salt, that it does 2 things simultaneously. It draws blood that is absorbed in the meat outwards, but it will cause blood that was on the outside to be absorbed back inwards. Now, according to this first view, that blood that had been on the surface of the meat, if it had not been rinsed off, it would no longer be possible, if that blood was reabsorbed into the meat, it would not be possible to cause it to be exuded from the meat through salting, because the power of the power of salt to cause the blood to be exuded, the blood that was absorbed in the meat, the power of salt to cause this blood to be exuded is where the blood had so far not been exuded out of the meat. But the salt will not have sufficient strength to cause blood that was reabsorbed into the meat to come out again. And for that reason, we would be left with a severe problem if the meat had not been rinsed before the salting process, because the blood on the surface is considered to be likely to be reabsorbed into the meat, and salting alone will no longer enable this blood to be exuded. That's the first approach to the purpose of the rinsing. The second approach is that the purpose of the rinsing is indeed to remove the residue of congealed blood that may be on the surface of the meat, but for a different reason. And the reason is, according to this second opinion, that if we do not wash off blood on the surface of the meat, the blood on the surface of the meat, when the salt is applied to the meat, the blood will weaken the power of the salt to do its job. the salt will get filled with the blood that is on the surface of the meat, and this salt will no longer have the power to exude, to cause the blood that was absorbed in the tissues of the meat to be exuded. Now, let us contrast the second approach with the first approach. The second approach, that we fear that the power of the salt will be weakened. Why is the first approach, why is the second approach not concerned with the issue that we saw in the first approach, that blood on the surface of the meat might get absorbed back? Why is the second approach not concerned with this? Because according to the second approach, even though there may be some blood on the surface of the meat, that blood is not considered to be in the same category as a blood that came out of the animal either at the time of the slaughter or out of the blood vessels of the animal. It's not considered to be what in Hebrew is called dam ba'ayin, that is to say, blood that is actually in its regular state. But this blood on the surface of the meat is considered to be blood that has already been exuded from the tissues. And for that reason, according to the second approach, even if that blood that was on the surface of the meat was reabsorbed, that doesn't matter, because we have a principle in all of the laws of kashrut, kivol'o ken polto, kivol'o, as in its absorbing of something, so too will it exude something. If the salt has the power to get this blood on the surface of the meat to get reabsorbed into the meat fibers, the salt will also have the power to cause any blood that was reabsorbed to be exuded from the meat. And so the second approach is that the purpose of rinsing the meat is not to prevent blood getting reabsorbed, but it is because the power of the salt will be weakened if the meat was not washed off of traces of blood on its surface. Now, according to both of these two approaches that we've heard, there's no difference in the manner of the rinsing process of the meat before the salting, because according to both approaches, there's no need to rinse very, very thoroughly or even to rub the meat until all traces of blood go off it. It's sufficient to rinse the meat and to rub it until all visible traces of blood have disappeared. And how should this be done? One should rinse the meat and rub over it until one sees that the water that is running off the meat is clear and not discolored by blood. And then it's quite clear that already all traces of blood on the piece of meat will have been removed. Now, between these two first approaches, there is a difference halachically that comes out of them. As regard to the way that the meat is salted if it was not rinsed before the salting process, because the first approach was that the purpose of the meat is the purpose of the rinsing is to remove any blood on the surface. If there was blood, if the meat was not rinsed prior to the salting, according to the first approach, then the moment that salt is applied to the meat for kashering it when it was not yet rinsed, the salt, as we saw, will cause the blood on the surface to get reabsorbed back into the meat, and therefore salting will no longer be sufficient to bring out forth blood reabsorbed from this meat. Now, in the case of the second approach, where the concern was that the salt on the surface of the meat would get weakened by traces of blood, if the meat were to have been salted without having been rinsed, there is a simple repair for this, that you will wash off all the salt that was rendered ineffective by the traces of blood, and you can salt that meat again. So that is a halachic difference that comes out of these different approaches. Well, now we come to the third approach as to the reason for the need for rinsing the meat before the salting process. According to the third approach, the purpose of the rinsing is to soften the meat on its surface, because naturally meat tends to get stiffer on its surface, and if it will not be softened, the salt, when applied to the meat, will not have the power to cause the blood to be exuded. It won't be able to overcome the stiffness of the meat. And for this reason, according to this third opinion, it will not be sufficient simply to rinse the meat relatively lightly, to a small extent, the way that one would use to simply clear off surface blood from the meat. We'd have to rinse the meat very thoroughly and extensively and rub it a lot until the meat has got softened on its entire surface, and only then to apply the salt. Now, the fourth approach is that the purpose of the rinsing is not only to soften the exterior of the piece of meat, but it's actually to soften up the entire piece of meat, including on its interior, because the nature of meat is that not only does its surface tend to get stiffened, but so does the whole of the piece of meat. And if the entire piece of meat will not be softened prior to the salting process through a very thorough rinsing and rubbing and manipulation, then the salt will not have the power to cause the blood absorbed in the interior of the meat to be exuded. So according to this, even very extensive rinsing of the meat will not be sufficient. We have to add to the rinsing of the meat a process of rubbing and softening and massaging and manipulating the piece of meat, so that when the salt is applied, the salt will have its effect on the interior of the meat. So now we see that according to these last two approaches, the third approach, that the purpose of the salting is to soften the exterior of the meat, and the fourth approach, that the purpose of the purpose of the rinsing is to soften the exterior of the meat, and the fourth approach, that the purpose of the rinsing is to soften the entire piece of meat in order, including its interior. According to both approaches, the purpose of the rinsing is to enable the meat to become sufficiently soft that the salt will indeed have its effect of removing all of the blood inside it. So therefore, if one came to salt meat without previously having rinsed it, then it's clear, according to these last two approaches, that it would still be possible to go back and rinse it properly, since if it was salted without having been rinsed, we are saying that the salt will not have its proper effect. Either it won't penetrate the surface or it won't penetrate to the inside. And obviously we can rinse it properly again even after it was salted, because the initial salting would not have caused any blood to have been exuded, since the meat was too hard. And in any event, the second salting after a proper rinsing will ensure that the meat is properly kashered, because the rinsing will afterwards have ensured the meat has become softer. And therefore, if meat was salted without having been rinsed, according to the first approach, that the purpose of the salting is to remove surface blood so it won't get reabsorbed, if the meat was salted without having been rinsed, the meat cannot be permitted for consumption. Salt will no longer have the power to exude the blood. And according to the second, third, and fourth approaches, if the meat was not salted initially, it will still be possible to exude to salt the meat a second time to get the blood to be exuded. Well, now this is typical of halakhic analysis. What Rabbi Aaron Pfeiffer has done in this chapter is to brilliantly, concisely summarize the different opinions of the Rishonim on the subject of salting in much the same way that a professor of medicine would have to analyze and give an anatomy of the subject in order for the students to fully understand the subject. And we do need to understand that these laws are intended not only for serious Torah students, but particularly for people who aspire to be ordained as rabbis and who need to have a thorough understanding of the foundations of the laws. And let us recall that while it may seem that we are quibbling about very small details, here we're talking about an aspect of spiritual hygiene. We are trying to ensure that there is no chance that any traces of blood will remain absorbed in the meat. Granted that in the shechita process, the actual incision, the cut in the windpipe and the gullet of the animal with the severing of the arteries, the head will cause the blood which the soul goes out on to come out of the animal, and that is the most serious prohibition of blood, where the infringement of which carries the penalty of karet, of spiritual excision. The prohibition of consuming blood absorbed in the meat after that gush of blood has gone out, that is somewhat less stringent. It is a lav, a prohibition of the Torah, but does not carry the penalty of karet. Nevertheless, our goal is to ensure that all of the blood will be caused to be exuded by this tried and tested method of salting the meat. And that is why, for the sake of rabbinical students, we are analyzing the subject in such detail, and in the forthcoming sections of our study we will be looking at the halachic consequences which flow from these different shitot, these different opinions, and how they need to be applied in different circumstances. So with that, we conclude now the halachic dimension of this discussion. And without further ado, let us now turn to the Hasidic insights which we'll gain on this whole subject from the writings of Rabbi Nosson of Breslov, now turning to a new discourse from his work Likutei Halachot, now in Yoredea, the laws of the prohibition of chelev and dam, of forbidden fat and blood, the fourth discourse, beginning now at the 9th section of that discourse, which specifically addresses the prohibition of fat and blood. So this comes after a very extensive discussion which digresses into many areas of our Torah tradition, but here in this section of the discourse, Reb Nosson comes explicitly to look at the specific prohibition of fat and blood of animals. The purpose, now, says Reb Nosson, the purpose of this prohibition is in order to subdue and to dissipate two kinds of profound questions which arise in people's minds in their attempt to find a way to faith. That is to say, Reb Nosson is teaching us that those that do consume the forbidden fat and or the blood of the animal, since the food is nourishing the brain and the mind and the soul, because the brain is like the wick of a candle where the oils in the body rise to the brain, and it is through the oils rising to the brain, the nutrients, that the brain is able to function as the wick to the light of the soul, which burns up these nutrients in the body. Well, if the nutrients are non-kosher, then the impurity that clings to the fat and the forbidden fat in the blood, they will affect the person's thinking. And if they consume these items, then these items, as we have seen in the previous discourses of Reb Nosson, these embody trapped divine energy which is held in captivity by the forces of impurity, and this gets expressed in the person's mind by two levels of questions that may arise in people's minds, and these are explained in Rabbi Nachman's teaching in Likutei Moharan, the first volume of the original Hebrew edition, teaching 62, where he explains that some of our questions about God can be answered. Others cannot be answered in our existence in this life. For example, how could it be that human beings are given free will and yet God knows what we are going to do? This is a conundrum to which Rabbi Nachman says there is no answer in this life. So these two levels of forbidden fat and forbidden blood, they will give rise to two kinds of false consciousness in the person. Dealing with the first set of conundrums, there are conundrums that it is possible to resolve them. Only sometimes the pathways of the mind become closed up and the person finds it impossible to resolve these issues that haunt them, and that is when it is necessary for a person as a remedy to study the poskim. Rabbi Nachman teaches there in Likutei Moharan, part 1, Torah 62, that the study of the poskim, the study of the halacha according to the different views and learning how to resolve them and reconcile them with one another, this is conducive to clarifying our questions of hashkafa, our questions of world outlook and philosophy. However, the second level of kushiyot, of conundra that arise in our efforts to find faith in God, one cannot resolve them. And here we have to rely only on faith. And faith can only be complete through fasting. Because when a person fasts, they are denying the nutrients to the brain, and therefore the brain is forced to go deeper in order to extract nutrients that were deep buried within the body. And through this, there Rabbi Nachman in Likutei Moharan, Torah 62 in part 1, he explains that through the fast, the effect of the fast is actually to release the spiritual powers of the person, the speech of the person, which is emblematic of the person's spirituality in this world, through which the person is able to pray and speak words of Torah. Through the fast, the spiritual effect of the fast is to release speech from its exile in Egypt, and through this our faith becomes perfected when holy speech is redeemed. So now he goes more deeply into the prohibitions of fat and blood. The prohibition of the forbidden fat comes in order to rectify our divine consciousness, so that our divine consciousness, our da'at, will not, so that the pathways of intellect will not be stopped up. So this way we will be able to resolve those questions on our faith, that it is possible to resolve them. Because the forbidden fat comes from the fats of the body, and through the fats of the body comes about the main repair of the mind and the intellect, because the intellect burns like the flame of a candle through the fats in the body, as explained by Rabbi Nachman elsewhere. And that is why it is forbidden to consume the forbidden fat of an animal, in order that the fat of the animal should not hold sway in the person's consciousness and stop up their intellect altogether. Because when the fats, which are under the power of the forces of impurity, hold sway, the divine intellect in the person becomes completely closed up, and one can come to altogether forget God Almighty, as it is written in the Psalms of the wicked, Ze darkom kesel lomo. This is the way of those who have this kesel, this thick fold of fat. They are fattened by their prosperity, and the fat covers over their very intellect. And our rabbis of blessed memory said, this is the fat that they have over their flanks that is stopping up their kidneys from wise counsel and stopping up their very minds. And another verse in Psalms, this is the category of chelbomoi sogru, their fats have covered them over. Another verse in Psalms, ki chiso ponov bechelboi, has covered his face with fat, the fat of very obese, overweight people whose faces are covered with fat. Well, the face, the ponim, that is actually a code word for the sechel, the inner intellect. As it says in Proverbs, the wisdom of a person will give light to his face, that is his inner face, his inner intellect. And through the attack of these fats, the intellect can get closed up and covered over to the point where a person is unable even to resolve those questions that can be resolved. And through this, the person can forget God Almighty and become alienated and separated from Him, God forbid, because the root of alienation from God, forgetting from God, is through a person coming to a level of denial, that is to say, a lack of faith. And this lack of faith and this denial of the presence and the providence of God comes from these questions that arise in the person's mind and the concealment of the understanding of God that exists in the heart of each one. And that is why the Torah has warned us against eating the forbidden fat of the animal, the suet, and those fats that were offered on the altar in the temple, in order that the divine intellect within us should not be closed up and stopped up, in order that we should be able to understand and to find answers to the questions and the conundra that it is impossible, that it is possible to answer. On the other hand, the prohibition of blood comes to rectify our speech. And this, says Reb Nosson, as he will explain, is a repair to our very faith. Because the whole repair of speech has as its purpose to release speech from its exile in Egypt, the exile under Pharaoh and his ministers. And let us remember that the ministers of Pharaoh in the story of Joseph are his butler and his baker and his butcher. And these, say our sages, correspond to the vital areas of the human being, the gullet and the windpipe and the arteries of the neck. And the ministers of Pharaoh stand there at what is called the narrow part of the throat, Meitzar Hagaron. The throat is the garon, the Meitzar Hagaron is the narrow part, and Mitzrayim is seen as emblematic of the throat and the neck, where if the person is able to get their words up from their heart out through their mouths, that is a state of redemption. But if the words are held back in the throat, They are held in captivity by Pharaoh and his ministers. That is a state of exile. As now Reb Nosson goes to explain, it is known from our holy books, from the writings of the Ari, that in Egypt, in the exile, there was an attack of blood. That is to say, just as there are illnesses in the human being where there's high blood pressure, where there is excess of blood, and this was an earlier view of situations of human sickness, that the blood would hold sway too much. This was the very essence of the exile in Egypt, as explained in the writings of the Kabbalah. And thus the verse says in Ezekiel, which we recite in the Pesach Haggadah, I passed over you and I saw that you were wallowing in your blood, because speech comes from the blood. For the blood is the soul, as we have discussed. The blood is the seat of the worldly soul, the worldly ego, and speech comes forth from the nefesh, part of the soul, as it's written in Genesis, the account of the creation. Vayhi ha'odam lenefesh chayo, the man became a living nefesh, a living soul. Targumo, the Aramaic Targum here is, man became ruach mamallelo, he became a spirit that was speaking. As Rabbi Nachman discusses several times, that is to say, the very essence of the human, and throughout Chassidut and Kabbalah, human is called medaber, the speaker. The very essence of the expression of a person's nefesh is that they speak. But when the blood of the Sitra Achra, of the forces of the other side, that is to say, the thoughts and the impulses and the desires of the evil inclination, arise in the person reaches a state where they are unable to speak holy words of prayer and Torah at all. Like the verse in the Psalms, Ne'elamti dumio, I've been struck dumb in silence. And the Hebrew word dumio is an expression that has a connotation of blood. And that is why it is forbidden to consume blood, in order to subjugate the bad blood, the evil blood that brought about the very essence of the exile in Egypt. When speech went into exile, there was no revelation of God through speech. And through being careful to avoid all chelev, forbidden fat, and all blood, through this we are able to repair our holy intellect, our knowledge and understanding of God, and namely through the abstinence from chelev, and also through the abstinence from blood, to draw out speech from its exile in Egypt. And that is the repair to our faith, when we are able to speak words of holiness. Now, the foundation of everything is the repair of our faith. And the main repair is through the ta'anit, through a fast, and likewise through the abstinence from forbidden fat and blood. Because through a fast, a person's own chelev fat and their very blood is diminished, as we say in the prayer that is offered after a fast day, may it be your will that by my reducing my fat and blood, that this should be acceptable before you, O Lord, as if I had offered a sacrifice on the altar. Now, likewise, through our abstaining from the eating of the forbidden fat and blood, this has the same effect as the holiness of a fast, because one limb will give strength to another. That is to say, the forbidden fat will strengthen the fat in the human that covers over their faith, and the forbidden blood will strengthen the bad blood in them. So if people were eating the forbidden fat and the blood, there would be just too much of this forbidden fat with its concealing effect on the consciousness, and the forbidden blood with its holding the speech in exile in the person. And now that we abstain from this, automatically the fat and bad blood in us is reduced, and that's the effect of the past, and that is the main repair of our faith. And now Reb Nosson goes back in expanding the subject to the place of the forbidden fat and the blood in the sacrifice. The main sacrifice on the temple altar was the offering of the emurim, the inner fats, and the dam, the blood, the sprinkling of the blood on the altar. The forbidden fat of the animal goes up on the altar, is entirely burned up for a sweet savor to the Lord, and this is because the fat, which is the fatty, oily nutrients which provide the fuel for the intellect, we ourselves do not have, as humans, the power in our hands to purify our holy intellect through the consumption of the fat of an animal. And that's why the prohibition of the fats of the animal, the chelev fat, is so very stringent, because anybody who consumes this forbidden fat will automatically have their spiritual sensitivity closed up, and what will happen is in their minds will arise thoughts of denial. There will arise all kinds of questions that will push them further and further away from any awareness of God. However, on the altar in the temple, it was precisely the chelev fat that was offered up for a sweet savor. And the reason is that the temple itself is in the category of divine wisdom and understanding. This is stated numerous times in the writings of Rabbi Nachman. The temple itself is a physical manifestation, a physical emblem in stone and courtyards and buildings of the different facets of God's revelation, the different partsufim which interrelate in the way that the halls and the gateways and the walls and the chambers of the temple relate to one another. The whole temple is itself in the category of supreme wisdom, and there the supreme wisdom shines a wisdom and a level of knowledge and understanding that's most exalted. And for that reason, it is possible on the altar for the forbidden fats of the animal to be offered as fire offerings for a sweet savor, because and precisely through the burning of the chelev fat on the divine altar, the divine sechel, the divine awareness and intellect shines with an even greater force to reveal his godliness, because the burning of the fat on the altar is the producing the light of a light that shines forth from the intellect in just the same way as there is a fire kindled in the human body through the oils arising to the brain, causing the brain to shine forth. So this happens on the altar, except that we as humans would not have the power to sift out the divine sparks in the animal forbidden fats, but the altar does have this power. Through the altar, the divine sechel, the divine intellect and wisdom is revealed and shines forth, and through this it is possible to reconcile and to do away with all of those questions and conundra that can be resolved. And this will strengthen faith. And that's why the chelev fat on the altar has the power to secure atonement for those that bring the offering, because the main essential, the root flaw of all of the different sins is the denial of godliness, the doubts and the questions and the lack of faith which are caused through a person's sins. And for that reason, through the offering on the altar, by offering the fat on the fire of the altar, through this the divine intellect is expanded and our faith is strengthened, and that is why the blood on the altar has the power of atonement. With that, my dear friends, we come to the end of our studies today, and this being the week of Purim, we're looking forward on Wednesday evening throughout the world to the reading of Megillat Esther and the beginning of the Purim celebrations, and on Thursday throughout the world, with the exception of the holy city of Jerusalem and a few ancient walled cities elsewhere, the rest of the world on Wednesday night and Thursday will be celebrating Purim, and for that reason we will not be holding a session of our studies this Thursday. With the help of God, next Sunday we'll be continuing with the studies, and so to regular sessions next week and the week afterwards, until sometime after that we should be coming to our break for Pesach to enable us to make all of our necessary preparations. So with that, I would like to wish you shalom from the holy city of Jerusalem and Purim Sameach. May all of the repairs that are brought about through our joy on Purim be accomplished through our celebration this Purim. Shalom and Purim Sameach.